All right, podcast audience, thank you so much for joining us on the very first ever episode of the Telling Stories podcast. I am Andrew Crabtree, your host. You might see my face on YouTube if you've been to our YouTube channel. And if you hadn't, you should check it out. It's youtube.com/tellingstories, easy enough. I am joined today by my co-host and good friend, Rik Maxedon. Rik, thanks for coming.
You got it, Andrew. I'm excited about what we're going to do today. This should be a good time.
Yeah, we're going to try something a little different. And this whole episode, we're going to call this the intro episode, is going to be a podcast that's going to introduce what we're doing for the rest of the duration of however long we do this.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it.
So this is something really fun. I think Rik and I both, having known each other a little bit, are people who would say we love narrative.
Absolutely.
So if you've ever seen the introduction, or I call it the intro to telling stories, or telling stories for beginners. Beginner's Guide to Telling Stories, actually. Yeah, I made the movie.
Right.
I know the title. It's the trailer for my YouTube video, and it's all about how much I love stories and why. From the time I was a little boy, I loved stories of all kinds. And I think my love of story came from when I was a really little kid sitting on my dad's knee, and he would tell me stories about when he was a kid. I love to hear my mom and dad tell stories about when they were kids. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, my favorite stories were the stories that my dad told me about his grandpa telling him stories.
Yeah.
So my dad's grandpa was a farmer, and my dad's favorite memories from when he was a kid were when he would sit on his grandpa's knee.
Wow.
And listen to him tell stories when it was raining. So they would all the kids would sit out on the back porch and watch it rain, because you can't farm in the rain.
Right.
And so my dad's grandpa and his aunts and uncles would all sit around and tell stories.
Yeah.
And so
it's so funny how we're a story consuming creature.
Yeah.
It's not a generational thing. It's been happening forever.
Back.
Yeah.
And now probably in a culture of streaming and streaming services and the competition of Netflix and Hulu and cable and Prime, and I think I read somewhere that there's been more content created, whether that be written word or visual, but more content has been created in the last year than the last 100,000 years before that.
Wow. That's incredible.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So
technology is helping us.
Yeah, in most ways, I think. So I love narrative. So from those times of the verbal storytelling of my dad when I was a kid to I remember, and we've talked about this before between us, but I think back to I'm old enough by a little bit to remember VHS tapes, and so I think if maybe I'm 31 and maybe if you were 26, 27, you don't know what I'm talking about, but my dad actually...
Maybe you're 47 like me, you know exactly what you're talking about.
You're right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So my dad recorded Back to the Future, all three of them, from a network to a VHS tape, and I would sit on his lap and watch Back to the Future, and then I would hop up and fast forward through the commercials. And
you were the remote control.
I was the little kids were the original remote control.
Yes, absolutely.
So I would fast forward through the commercials, and we would watch Back to the Future. And I remember that there's this feeling to this day I get when I watch Back to the Future. But that first time I watched Back to the Future, it was like, and this is hokey, but it was like magical. Like there was like this.
Yeah.
This feeling that I got watching Back to the Future, where I was just sitting in awe of the creativity.
Right, and then not just the creativity of it, but then for me, the residual creativity. Where I'm laying in my bed thinking about, well, if he did this back in time, and then what did that do? And so you just wind up spinning, and then you think about what would this do if this were my life? How would I? And so I think story does that for you.
I agree. Did you ever hear the story about, and here I am about narratives again, but so Bob Gale.
You're going to tell a story.
I'm going to tell a story on the Telling Stories podcast about telling stories. Meta. So Bob Gale.
And we might go back in time.
If these cameras have got just enough magic in them. So Bob Gale was the guy that had the original idea for Back to the Future.
Okay.
He co-wrote it, co-produced it with Robert Zemeckis, who probably gets a lot of the credit for that film. But Bob Gale was the guy with the original idea.
Really?
He's from St. Louis guy.
Okay. Cool.
Went to University City High,
right.
As did his parents. He went to USC Film School, and while he was at USC Film School, came home for Christmas and was going through his dad's old high school yearbooks.
Okay.
Found out that his dad at University City High here in St. Louis was the class president of his class. Okay. And it blew his mind, because that's not the type of person that he associated his dad with being.
Right. His dad wasn't cool.
He didn't think his dad was cool, and he was the class president. And so it got him thinking about if he could have gone back in time and met his dad when he was in high school.
Wow. So he wrote Back to the Future because he looked at a yearbook.
Yeah, and it's funny enough, and this, if you've seen Back to the Future, you know what I'm talking about. But
Who hasn't seen Back to the Future?
If you're listening to this and you haven't seen Back to the Future, stop listening to us right now.
Right.
And go Prime.
If you're at all interested in film and you haven't seen Back to the Future,
go back and watch all of it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But he one of the strongest feelings he got when he started going through this journey of writing Back to the Future is he's like, what if my mom, who always came across as such a prude, was really, was not so prudish in high school.
Right.
And so that kind of stirred into the
that's
the
Leah
scene where
Thompson's
Lorraine.
character. Yeah. That's great.
One of my favorite scenes in film where they're in the car and he's trying to turn her off. And
right.
He's turning his mom on. And she kisses him and it's this weird moment. But yeah.
I don't know what it is. But when I kiss you, it's like I'm kissing my brother. I guess that doesn't make any sense, does it?
Believe me, it makes perfect sense.
So a little St. Louis connection to Back to the Future that I appreciate.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Learned something new today.
Listen, when I get onto a movie or a narrative, I kind of obsess. So there's going to be a lot of these episodes that we're going to get into stories.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring a lot of off-camera stories that I've read about and think are fun.
Okay.
So it's just little wrinkles that
Another
add
reason
just
why I
a
can't
little
wait.
bit of just add a little bit of value to these. So
sounds great.
So I think when we look at why we want to do this podcast is we love narrative, we love talking about movies, and it's a chance for us to get together, hang out, and talk about movies.
Right.
Which is going to be fun for us, whether or not anybody listening to this cares or not.
That's what I said. I don't care if anybody listens or not. It's a great chance to talk about film.
But I think also, as much as we love narrative, I think we both love the gospel equally.
Yeah.
I'm sure more. And so maybe tell the audience about kind of your background and where you fit into that.
Yeah, so I pastor a small church in North St. Louis County, and started that church in March of 2007, and before that was in youth ministry and all those things. And I've always been interested in film, and I've always been interested in stories. And just sort of naturally for me, I'm always looking for the gospel angle or the redemption angle. It drives my wife crazy. We go watch a movie on a date, and I want to, okay, babe, let's go have some pie, and let's talk about the redemption themes that showed up in this movie. And she's like, no, I just want to go have fun tonight.
Just want to watch the movie.
But I always want to engage with, because I think every good story is really just a retelling of the gospel. And that's why I'm excited about this podcast. So you get to be like kind of my stand-in. My wife is excited because I want to have to talk to her about it. I have an outlet to talk. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So
thank you, podcast audience, for being Pastor Rick's sounding board.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm excited about finding themes. And one of the things we've kind of talked about is there's a very specific related movie that will have like an allegory that will talk specifically about, you can draw direct parallels. And another idea is just to see thematic ideas, more subtle, more less didactic teaching about what the gospel is, but instead gospel themes.
And what I think is really cool is us being different people that have different outlooks. Like, I think I'm always a little more apt to see that allegory and take things a little more literal, where I think you're going to draw more of the subtleties. And I think that we can kind of balance each other in a fun way, hopefully, for the listener on that.
Can we let a cat out of the bag like the first two movies?
Yes. So the first two movies are actually like, okay, so I said, I'm going to pick a movie. Rick, you're going to pick a movie. And we shared them. And as we talk about these two different ways that you can see this allegorical and the more subtle or thematic, like we both went in very extreme directions with that.
Right.
Unintentionally. We picked two movies.
Yeah.
So I picked The Goonies, which is one of my all-time favorites when we talk about movies that made me feel magical back when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And you picked Manchester by the Sea.
Yeah.
Which The Goonies is going to be very straightforward, allegorical, and Manchester by the Sea is going to be a little more subtle.
Right. And so they're different in that respect, but they're also different in like their nature. So Goonies is very lighthearted, silly, fun fantasy. And Manchester by the Sea is a very deep and dark reality.
My heart was broken. It's always going to be broken.
And so, and the other, there's a pretty bow that's tied at the end of the Goonies.
Yeah.
And there's not a pretty bow that's tied at the end of Manchester by the Sea.
Very different in those, and like honestly, like it made watching both of those movies, and I watched them both last night to dust up, but it made it fun because like you're right, The Goonies, like it ends in the arms of your loved ones and One-Eyed Willie's ship sailing off into the sunset.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at Cauldron Point and what appears to be a pirate ship.
And it's this very closed book.
Right. We have all that we wanted.
Yeah, and it was great.
We had a problem at the beginning, and it
We
got
had
solved,
an adventure, and now the
happy.
adventure's over.
Yeah, right.
And Manchester by the Sea is about as different of an ending as you could possibly get.
Right.
Just let it go.
Yeah, and I think that's where, at least for me, I'm drawn to good art that leaves you with questions.
Yeah.
Because I think that's like, I think the gospel is more like the Goonies, and it ends with like a pretty bow that's tied up and everybody's happy. But here in this reality, we're not quite there yet. There's this darkness. There's this uncertainty. There's this, we got to draw our own conclusions to what we're experiencing. And the pain that movie talks about it is really beautiful.
I think I texted you this yesterday. I was like, I literally went after watching Manchester by the Sea for the first time and pulled my son out of the crib and hugged him.
That's great.
For so many reasons, but it was just, it makes you think a lot. And I can't wait. So that'll be episode 3. So if you're listening to this is a hard teaser for next week is the Goonies and the week after is going to be Manchester by the Sea. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about both of them. But
grab your phone right now, make plans, and
give
yourself a reminder.
Subscribe to this podcast right now, and you'll just get an alert from iTunes or Google or whoever. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to talk about those stories. And I think it's good. And so we've talked a lot about allegory, and I just want to make sure that I was I don't even know if you know this. So before I went into marketing and graphic design, I was on the path to being a high school English teacher.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I was at Missouri Baptist University. That makes sense now. Yeah, Missouri Baptist University. I was taking a lot of literature classes and teaching classes, and as soon as I did my first practicum and got in a classroom, I was like, "Wow, kids are crazy, and I don't want to do this."
Right.
So, and it didn't help that when I went to my advisor, I found out I had way more classes left than I thought I did. So that made my decision for me. But I want to make sure that, so we talk about allegory. That's a big word for people that aren't familiar with maybe English classes. So it's basically I want to hear your interpretation of this, but I see allegory as being a narrative that is very directly, symbolical or alludes to another story. So I would say, a symbolical narrative or a representation of something else very clearly.
Right.
So I think that growing up in the church, every the allegory that's probably most famous for Christian moms pushing on their kids is the Chronicles of Narnia.
Right.
Which is great because I love the Chronicles of Narnia. I really do.
Great.
It's a wonderful story, but C.S. Lewis is a very many Christian works, and it's a very direct allegory of the story of Christ with Aslan being Jesus.
Yeah.
And, wonderful story, but most Christian moms that are pushing Chronicles of Narnia, and we've talked about this too off the podcast, is those moms aren't pushing maybe Harry Potter.
Right, but they're really the same story.
They're remarkably the same story. And so I hope that my mother listens to this episode and know that I'm not giving you grief for this, Mom. I love you. But my mother was one of those that did not want me to read Harry Potter. And so I would put a dust jacket over the top of my hardcover copy of Harry Potter that I took from the school library. And I would read Harry Potter at home and on youth trips. And so I think,
would you, on those youth trips, would you repent at the end of the night? For...
I never did. I never felt bad about it.
All right, good.
I just didn't.
Good.
And especially
because I would have been a youth minister about your age, and I would have probably tried to make you feel bad about doing that.
Maybe
and
the
I've
lie
repented for that, by the way.
Maybe the deception. Maybe I should have, but I always would read Harry Potter, and I just, even at a young age, I saw the relationship to the gospel.
And I think that's at the heart of what we're doing and why we want to do this, because C.S. Lewis, when he writes Chronicles of Narnia, is a follower of Christ,
right?
And so
intentionally writing it as an allegory,
right? So and that happens, that it creates. So art that comes out of the Christian is going to have themes about Christianity and the gospel, but Harry Potter was not that,
right?
And I think that gets to the heart of what we're trying to get to here, is that every good story points to the gospel.
Hey, she's only interested in you because she thinks you're the chosen one.
But I am the chosen one.
I think it's even, I don't know, I think it means more to me when I read a secular story that is in no means trying to be a gospel allegory.
Yeah.
When I see that, or, even the subtle themes, like when I see that in a movie that is very clearly not a Christian movie,
right,
it just makes me feel that much more passionate about it.
So there's a video that you can find on YouTube to search Tim Keller on stories, and he tells a story about Tolkien and Lewis together, talking about
really cool clip.
Stories.
And yet, Tolkien says we still crave a certain kind of story. We crave it in movies. We crave it in books.
It's out of like an 11, 12-minute long video clip, but he's talking about that idea is that like under every story is another story, and we're thinking about these ideas of every good story points to hope, or that good will triumph over evil, or love will never end, or that we have sacrificial heroes, and he talks about that. But then Lewis, before he became a Christian, would say, well, those are all lies. That's not reality. But what Tolkien says is that like it actually points to a deeper reality.
Right. That even though fairy stories at the factual level aren't true, most people feel in some ways they are true.
That while those are lies, that love does end sometimes, and sometimes evil does win over good, and sometimes our heroes aren't sacrificial, they're selfish. And sometimes that's the reality, but all of the stories that we tell in that regard are pointing to a deeper reality that is found its culmination in Jesus.
And that is a story that the ending is never going to change and is never, never wavering.
Right. And our craving for that story.
Yep. It's very deep-seated. So,
I'm sorry, I like to get deep.
No, I like it. And so I think, so I named my channel Telling Stories back in January of 2018 when I started this YouTube channel. A few months later, mutual acquaintance of ours, mutual friend Scotty Clayton, was out to lunch with me, and he had a bin of books that I think he was taking to donate. And he said, hey, Telling Stories, it's kind of cool. I have this book called Telling Our Stories. It's by a guy named Mike Cosper, and I didn't know Mike Cosper and never heard of this book. Had a cool cover.
Yeah.
But I think it's called the book's called The Stories We Tell, how film and movies reflect our longing for the gospel, or something like that.
Long subtitles deserve to be forgotten.
Right, but I refer to the book as The Stories We Tell. And it sat in my truck for a really long time, and I was like, oh yeah, thanks, Scott. And I'd let it sit there for several months, making videos under this name of Telling Stories. Mm-hmm. And I started feeling a little bit, I don't know, like I was missing something, like it was a little bit empty or thin.
All right.
I love talking about movies. I love talking about narratives, but I wasn't getting as much of myself into it as I think I wanted.
All right.
And I read this book, and it's about just a lot of the things that we're talking about, how somewhere deep seated and ancient in us is this longing for our Creator, and there's somehow this like innate connection to the gospel, whether we acknowledge it or not.
Right.
And so secular storytellers and filmmakers and writers are putting these gospel themes and these gospel biblical ties into stories without even realizing it, because there's just something inside of us that longs for that.
It's a craving that we all have. And that's, I think, one of the things that I want this to kind of come out of this podcast is to teach ourselves and teach the audience to find these themes, whether they're strict allegory or whether they're a little more subtle thematic, to find the gospel in story, not just in the stuff that we consume in art and movies and books and podcasting and all that stuff, but also just in our own story.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the coolest things that I would love to see come out of this is even if just for us or a few friends that listen to this, like break down some of that barrier between Christian culture and pop culture, because sometimes I feel like they're at odds with each other. And if you can learn to see secular culture through the lens that I think you're meant to,
right,
then they don't have to be so, at war.
And let's face it, most of the Christian, like the intentional Christian pop culture is just not very good.
So I was,
and so let's find the good stuff, and then find the gospel in the good stuff.
And if we can teach kids to do that, then it's so much healthier for them just to exist in the culture that they don't always feel like they fit into.
I call it at your local Christian bookstore. There used to be this thing called Testaments. Are you familiar with Testaments? It's a breath mint.
Yeah,
and it was like at the counter, you go buy your Christian book, and there's Testaments. And so when I see like bad Christian art, I say that movie's a testament.
I still love McGee.
And most people think that movie's a testament, like that's a compliment that I'm making.
Yeah, no, but
it's not a testament. It's
a little more.
It's cheeseball bad Christian art.
I can't. I can't think of a quote unquote Christian movie that I really enjoyed, and that's no slight on people that are pouring themselves into those projects, but
yeah, there's value to
everybody's good at their thing, and Hollywood's Hollywood for a reason.
Right.
Hollywood just happens to be brutally lost.
Right.
But they're still telling
even
stories.
the brutally lost can tell stories about the gospel.
I completely agree, and that's what I think is cool about what we're doing here. I coming up from a kid in a youth group that really tried really hard to like Christian rock artists and Christian content. I just never found anything that resonated with me.
Right.
And so I kept, I just turned to Hollywood and I turned to fiction and that's
if you
where
have
my
on these
been.
gospel lenses, you can see the gospel in every story. And I hope to learn to teach myself and our audience that.
So I would be remiss, I think, if we didn't point out. So one thing audience listener hears us talking about Christ and gospel, and one thing I want to be very clear about is we are not your mom. Podcast listener. If you're a mom listening to this thinking, ooh, I'm going to have my kid listen to these guys and they'll know not to listen to or not to watch this movie.
Right.
You're going to be disappointed. That's not what we're doing. We're not going to be counting cuss words. We're not going to be giving recommendations. We are not responsible for guarding your heart. If you feel like you shouldn't watch something, don't watch it.
Right.
And if we ever get to a point where we feel like we shouldn't, we won't either. And
right.
Those movies that we feel like we shouldn't watch won't be on this podcast anyway.
Yeah.
But I think that we're gonna review and talk through and find gospel and R-rated movies. Manchester by the Sea has an R rating,
right? It has some pretty brutal language.
It's
real, but it's real.
It's so real. I don't want us to ever be mistaken for someone that's going to tell you not to consume something or come here to find little tidbits about films and little connections to the gospel, but don't come here for us to tell you what to watch and not to watch.
Right. And an addendum to that is don't send us tweets or emails about
Please.
How dare you choose such a movie and try to find the gospel in an R-rated movie.
To cease and desist to all trolls out there on the internet.
Yeah, if we talk about a film that's offensive to you, I encourage you to turn us off.
Right. Yes. Please.
Or if you have a little bit more of an open mind, maybe you find a film offensive and you could listen and maybe you could find your own gospel in that.
You can
film.
Redeem these bad movies.
It's and as we kind of wrap this introduction up and get ready to record episode 2, I think it's just really important for people to understand that this is something fun we're doing. This is something genuine, but these two worlds can coexist.
Yeah,
you can
absolutely.
be a Christian and live in the world, not of the world. Just break down some of these barriers.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm excited about it.
So that is the introduction to the Telling Stories podcast. We're really excited to maybe show you some allegory, some subtle themes, and just different ways that the gospel finds its way into modern storytelling and modern film. Come back next week, and we are going to, as previously mentioned, be going through Richard Donner's The Goonies, circa 1985. I'm excited just to talk about 80s film with you too.
Yeah, 80. Those are the best.
Of movies.
Yeah, we should do one series where we just do nothing but John Hughes movies for a while.
I could talk about every John Hughes movie.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, podcast audience, tune back next week. Hit that subscribe button, and if you liked anything you heard, give us a rating. Give us a rating on iTunes or Google Play, wherever you're listening, and help us to find new audience. So we appreciate you guys. Your time is valuable, and we appreciate it. Come back next week, and I've been Andrew Crabtree. He's Rik Maxedon. We'll see you next week.